Okay, so who am I? I'm Beth Tucker-Long, as Justin said. I am the editor-in-chief of PHP Architect Magazine. If you've never heard of the magazine, come and see me after. I have some issues you can take a look at. If you've ever thought about wanting to write for a professional magazine, let me know. We are one of the longest running tech magazines as far as PHP goes. We've been around for 11 years, and we, I believe, are the only magazine solely devoted to PHP and its technologies. So a lot of fun. We've been around for a long time. We publish in print, PDF, EPUB, and Mobi, so a wide variety of formats depending on what you'd like to read. And we would love to help you get published if you are interested. We have technical editors and copy editors who help you make sure you're sounding good and that everything's correct. So really all you need to do is have something you'd like to write about, and we'll help you with the rest. I also do some PHP teaching, and I'm a freelance consultant, and I'm also very active in my user group. Okay, but what we're talking about today is what happens when you get hacked. Well, the first step is, how do you know you've been hacked? Now, this talk is going to sort of focus a little bit on WordPress, but it also applies to lots of other CMSs, and the tools I'm going to talk about will also apply to different things as well. So even though a lot of the examples I give are WordPress, these can happen to anybody. So here's a website. Looks fine, right? However, when Google goes through and looks at that website, this is what Google sees. So you'll see here, it starts out okay with a blog of the South with recipes, blah, blah, blah. But then we get to that bold text. Now, the bolding was me. Obviously, Google doesn't see it in bold. However, what Google sees is a whole bunch of other stuff that we don't want on our website. Most likely, you don't want on your website, I should say. So what happened? If we look in the source code, there's a div. This div is not displaying. However, it's there for any robots that go through and scan your site, which means that search engines are picking it up, but you're probably not if you're just going to look at the site. So once you've realized that Google is indexing you under a whole lot of things you don't want to be indexed under, you might go and take a look at your content files. Okay, but all of your content files look normal. The database information looks normal. The admin panel is not showing this text in either the template or the front-end files. So where exactly is this coming from? So the first thing we want to do is stop at this point and change all your passwords, okay? Before we figure out what's causing it, let's make sure they don't still have access to your site. So pause, change the passwords for all of the accounts. If you use keys to access, change all of the keys. Check for any SSH keys that they left behind, so check in the SSH folder. You want to check the history for any shell commands they might have executed recently, so check the history there and see what they've been doing. Check the history of the user logins, and then contact your hosting company if you're hosting somewhere else. Let them know that your site has been compromised, because it actually might be on their end, not on yours. So you want to let them know as soon as possible, too. Okay? So now that we've sort of semi-locked things back down again, hopefully, let's take a look around and see where this is actually coming from. You might see some strange files. Okay? Cookies with some sort of random number of O's in there is a common one. So directories with words that are misspelled is pretty common. Also, functions. If there's suddenly a functions directory and you didn't make it, that's not good. So take a look for functions. Also, include files like include.php or inc.php, function.php or func.php, all very common files that could be compromised or could have been added by an attacker that you would not have put in there. Files that you might have put in there but may have had something added to them are your htaccess files, theme files, your uploads directory you're really going to want to check through with a fine-tooth comb, and config files. So check any sort of, especially if you're on WordPress, check your WordPress config file, make sure there's nothing extra in there. The htaccess files are a big one. A lot of times they'll put things in there to redirect or to inject things on page load. So double check your htaccess files. If you didn't create an htaccess file, just delete the one that's there, get rid of it. So these are common places to check. Another thing you can check is which files have been changed recently. So if this attack happened and you know that you were getting good Google search results a month ago and now you're not, you're going to want to take a look at what's changed in the last month. Now, it can be tough, though, to tell what's changed. For instance, here we have, I'm just doing a list on, let's see, on favicon.gif. I'm going to see if my pointer gets all the way up here. Yay, it does. OK. So here you can see we have March 19th, 2012 is the last time that's been changed. So if we're looking for an attack that's been recent, that's probably not going to do it. But now you'll see if I touch the favicon.gif, now it updates it to March 28th, 2013. So it's been updated. However, most attacks are not going to allow you to see that the file has been updated using the regular date. So you can see here, if I do a touch with a -t, I can actually set the date that the file was last changed. And so that's a lot of times what they'll do is they'll try to hide the fact that they've changed a file recently by setting the date on it. However, if we do a little bit of digging, we can find out what the actual change date was. So you can see here, I have, this time I've run a program called stat. A lot of times you'll have stat installed, although depending on what kind of shared, if you're on shared hosting, they may not allow you access to stat. In which case, you can use the lower example, which is ls minus cl, will give you the C time. So we're going to look at the C time of the file. And you'll see on the file that I just changed here, we have the access and the modify are both very old dates, saying, oh no, we didn't change anything in the last month or so. However, you'll see the C date, or the change date there, actually lists the date that I just touched that file, even though I specified a date when I did the touch. So by searching for the C date on files, you're going to get a much more accurate picture of which files have been changed recently. So you'll want to do a search, and you can do that using find. And here you can see I have a find. I'm searching through my whole directory, whatever is your directory that you want to search through. And I am searching for files. I'm searching the C time. And what I'm doing is I'm going to get all of the information for files that were done, say, within the last month. Or you can search within whatever range from when you know for sure the website was not compromised. So if you do find one of those files that was compromised and you get the C date on it, you'll want to search about 1 week back from that date. Because that file was changed then, but we don't know if that was the first time that they accessed your file system. So you want to search back a little ways, even if you find a C date. So we're going through and we're going to search, and it finds a couple of files. And so that can give you a heads up, too, on which files they might have changed or accessed. Another thing you can search for are eval statements. Now, eval statements can be used legitimately. However, a lot of times what happens with attackers is what they'll do is they'll do eval, and they'll inflate and base decode and all this stuff, and they'll encode it and encode it and encode it and encode it like hundreds of layers deep, just to try to make it really difficult for you to figure out what that code actually does. Because they're hoping that if you look at this and say, well, I don't understand what that means, you'll just ignore it, okay? Never ignore it. If you don't know what it does, it's probably not doing something good. So take a look and try to figure out what it is. They go through. This is oftentimes at the very top of the file or at the very bottom of a file. It can be anywhere in the file, but most commonly at the very top. So what you can do is you can change that eval to an echo, and it will echo out the code. However, like I said, they usually encode it, encode it, encode it, encode it. So you have to go through and change it to echo, then copy that code and change the eval in there to echo, and do that about 100 times. So it gets a little bit obnoxious trying to figure it out. However, if you go through and do all of that, a lot of times you'll find a really, really awesome admin panel, which is a lot of fun to play around with and terrible if you find it on your system. But it is a lot of fun. And what they basically do is they set up sort of a command line interface for themselves, an admin panel to access everything on your server, modify different things, add files, remove files, whatever they want to do, and all through this handy little backdoor admin panel that they've created for themselves. You can also trace access to different files. So once you find out when the file was modified, you can go back into your logs. Now, looking through log files is very difficult. However, you can use grep. take a look. So let's say we're looking up that cookies.php file, and we're going to find out which user accessed it. So you can kind of trace back now, and we're going to find out which user was compromised. It might be a user that they've added, or it could be one of our users that's been compromised. So any strange files that you find, you'll want to grep for in the logs. Once you find an entry, you'll have an IP address. Then you can grep for that IP address throughout the file and see what other files that IP address touched, or what other days that they accessed the file, and find out what other files were modified on that day. So it's kind of a find this, okay, and now search off of that, and now we're going to take and search off of all of these. So it's sort of a spider webbing search. And it can take a while, but it's the best way to find out what all they have done on your system. Because what you don't want to do is restore a copy of the file that you think is clean, but it turns out they actually accessed it a month prior to that. They just didn't do anything with it until a month later. So we want to make sure we're finding out everything they've touched and every time they've accessed, so that we can actually for sure say when we have a clean copy of this file. You can also grep for some of those keywords like eval, the base64 decode, and so on. Those, however, like I said, can legitimately be used in code, especially if you're using a content management system or a framework. You may have those in there legitimately, and so the grep is going to return a whole lot of false positives. If you are specifically using WordPress, you can also use some WordPress scanning plugins. There's an exploit scanner, which is put out by WordPress, and that's going to go through and sort of search for anything that would be suspicious on a WordPress site. This obviously doesn't help you if you're not using WordPress, but if you are, this is going to help you quite a bit. WP Scan is another plugin that you can also use. And I have my slides posted online if you want to get these links later. So once we've kind of figured out what they've done, where they access things, now we can start cleaning up. If you have a known clean backup, you can restore from that. Now, a known clean backup cannot be residing on the same server as the infected files, because we can no longer guarantee that that's stayed clean. It's best if you keep a copy of the backup offline somewhere where it can't be gotten to by anyone, so you know it's clean. You also want to make sure that we're going back far enough that we for sure have a clean copy before the exploit happened. A lot of times, they will access your system, add that backdoor admin panel, and then wait months and months before actually infecting your system to try to discourage you from being able to figure out where their backdoor is. Because you can clean up the exploit, but if you're restoring from an infected backup, they still have access to your system. You can go through and manually clean all of the changed files. This one is very, very time consuming, but if you can't trust your backup, this is your next best option. So you can go through and clean everything by hand. You'll want to double check any of those files that have been changed and make sure that you go through all the code, which again can be very, very time consuming, especially if you're on some sort of CMS or framework that has thousands of files. Then you're going to want to make sure your software is all up to date. One of the easiest ways for people to get in is through old copies of WordPress that haven't been patched yet, old plugins, and things like that. So you want to make sure that any software you're using on the server, any plugins that you're using, are all now on the most recent version. If you are using WordPress, one thing you can do if you don't have a clean backup is you can overwrite all of your core files with freshly downloaded ones. Now, if you've modified any of the core files, you're obviously going to have to go back through and make your modifications. But at least this will give you the core files cleaned, which gives you a leg up on having to manually, how many you have to manually go through. If you're using WordPress or any other language that uses themes or templates, if you are not using a templating system or one of the themes, uninstall it. Anything that you are not actively using, uninstall it. Because everything that is installed leaves the possibility of being an open doorway for hackers to come in. Now, that's not to say that all plugins or all themes have vulnerabilities. It's just saying that if you're not using it, don't leave it out there so you don't have to pay attention to what security flaws it might have. Just get rid of it. If you're going through and cleaning manually for WordPress, you're going to want to delete the plugins directory and reinstall all your plugins from scratch. The plugins are going to have thousands of files. It's too difficult to go through and do them all by hand. Once you have that done, you can go through the hardening instructions for WordPress, which you can find in the codex. I have the link up here. And that's going to help you lock down WordPress to make it more secure. And then you're going to want to go through your uploads directory and make sure you don't have any extra files that shouldn't be in there, especially any PHP files. Generally, in most cases, there's never a reason for a PHP file to be in the uploads directory. The uploads directory should be images and things that the users are uploading. They should not be uploading PHP files through the WordPress admin panel. So go through and double check and make sure that nothing's in there. Once you are sure everything is clean, then you want to go through and change all of the passwords again. Your users will hate you for this, but it's really an important step. You want to make sure you're not using passwords that are words, leet speak. The first letters of Bible verses is very popular. That is a bad idea. Those have all been cataloged and are very easy to hack. And it's recommended that you use passwords that are at least 15 characters long. There's lots of different ways that you can do passwords, and I'm not going to go through all the ways here, but these are just a couple of recommendations as far as making passwords that are a little bit more secure. Once you've changed all the passwords, you want to regenerate and reissue all SSH key pairs as well. Because again, we don't want to trust that those SSH keys have not been compromised in the meantime while we're cleaning things. So now everything is, we think, cleaned up, but the best thing to do now is to monitor to make sure this doesn't happen again, or to make sure we really did clean it all up like we thought. There's a lot of different programs you can use out there for monitoring. I'm just going to cover a couple. Vega will go through and crawl your website and scan specifically for vulnerabilities. So what this will tell you is, hey, I found a way to get in here, or I found an outdated plugin that has a vulnerability. It's going to match things up. So Vega is a great way to kind of go through and have it automated just tell you if it finds any vulnerabilities. It is not foolproof. It will not find everything, but it will give you some ways to go through. You can install WordPress plugins to help with scanning as well. Make sure you research any WordPress plugins that you install as far as scanning. I would double check a reputable website like WordPressBeginner.com before you go through and install them. Because what we don't want to do is install a WordPress plugin that is actually just a vulnerability for us. There are WordPress sites out there for WordPress plugins, and they manufacture malicious plugins to actually open up backdoors in your site. So make sure that you are only getting your WordPress plugins from a reputable site, and that you're sure that it's a reputable plugin as well. And another way you can do it is you can set up a cron job to keep an eye out for some of those keywords that we picked up on during the hack. So it's going to depend on which hack you were attacked with, but you can grep for some of the words like that eval or the base64 decode, or you could set up the first 10 characters of that encoded code that was put in. Search for those in case you have a lot of evals and base64 decodes already in your code. You can search for the actually obfuscated code. You can also go through and keep an eye out for file names, like those cookies file names. If you don't have a functions directory, keep an eye out for a functions directory. You can have the cron job tell you if your config files have been updated. So anytime the config files are updated, have it notify you. And different things like that. So there's a lot of different things that you can do as far as monitoring. There's a lot of different resources. And I apologize, I should have broken this up into 2 slides so it'd be a little bit easier to read here. So there's a spider simulator. What that does is it basically goes through and keeps an eye on what your site is looking like to spiders that crawl your site. This is a great way to notice that hack where they injected some code in on the page load. And so that will tell you if suddenly there are bad keywords that you don't want showing up. But just looking at your website, you don't see them, so your customers coming to the website aren't going to notice them and let you know that something's looking weird. So you could use a spider simulator to do that. There's a great talk by David Mirza, who works with Vega, and he talks about how he created a whole system for monitoring his sites. It was a talk at Confu last year called Do It Yourself Incident Response. And the PDFs are available online. So he has some good ideas for different monitoring things you could use as well. Go through the WordPress Codex as well. WordPress Codex has a lot of good information about what to do if your site is hacked, how to lock it down, what tools you can use, and things like that. So that can be very, very helpful as well. Another great article is How to Find a Backdoor in a Hacked WordPress Site. This one actually goes through and sort of talks about what to search for, what to look for, and what are common vulnerabilities. A little while back, there was a vulnerability in an image rendering, or it was an image resizing program, Tim Thumb, I think it was called. And everyone was like, oh, well, I don't use that. Okay, but there were millions of plugins that used that people didn't know about. And so everyone who had those plugins installed had the vulnerability, even though they didn't realize they were using that program. So a lot of times what happens is, you hear about something coming out and you think, oh, I don't use that, I don't need to worry about it. But if one of your plugins uses it somewhere, or one of your themes uses it somewhere, you're using it even if you don't know it. So it's important to kind of keep an eye on, what kinds of things you should look out for, even if you don't think you are using that specific plugin that was a problem. Your hosting company is another major source of vulnerability. So you want to make sure you're on a hosting company, especially if you're using WordPress, you want to make sure you're on a hosting company that's specifically for WordPress or specifically understands how WordPress needs to be locked down. A lot of shared hosting companies, what'll happen is they don't update their PHP MyAdmin versions, and PHP MyAdmin gets hacked, and suddenly they have access to your database and then get access to your area of the server, even though your area of the server wasn't where the vulnerability happened. So even if your account wasn't vulnerable, if you're on shared hosting and someone else leaves a vulnerability open, they could potentially get into you as well through that, especially if there's shared databases and things like that. So taking a look at your hosting if you're having issues with being hacked is a good place to start as well. Again, the exploit scanners, you want to make sure that your WordPress keys, if you do get hacked and you're using WordPress, you want to regenerate your keys, and there's an article up there about how to regenerate your WordPress keys. And then there's a malware removal article as well that's really good about removing malware from WordPress as well. So sometimes it's not even just that they get into the back end and they're messing with the back end, but they're specifically trying to mess up with the front end as well.